As I drove down the familiar highway, I couldn't help but notice the heavy fog blanketing the landscape. It was an ordinary drive, one I had taken countless times before back to my small hometown. The monotonous journey was usually uneventful, but today my GPS began acting strangely as I approached the old forest road. The device flickered, its screen displaying a convoluted route through the dense woods, a path I had never seen before. Confused, I glanced around, realizing the highway was eerily deserted. With a sense of unease, I decided to follow the GPS's guidance, thinking perhaps it knew a shortcut. As I veered onto the narrow, unpaved road, the trees seemed to close in around me. The fog grew thicker, obscuring my vision, and the forest felt alive, as if it were watching me. The GPS signal flickered erratically, its mechanical voice growing distorted. Then, without warning, it shut off completely. I was alone, with no signal, no map, and no idea how to get back to the highway. The sense of isolation was overwhelming, and a chilling sensation crept up my spine. I decided to keep driving, hoping to find a way out. The road twisted and turned, leading me deeper into the forest. The trees seemed to whisper and sway, even though there was no wind. Hours passed, and the forest showed no sign of ending. Night began to fall, and with it, a deep, unsettling darkness. I stopped the car, realizing I was hopelessly lost. The silence of the woods was deafening, only broken by the occasional distant, unidentifiable sound. It felt as though the forest itself was breathing, alive with a presence I couldn't see but could definitely feel. That night I barely slept, the car my only refuge. Every creak and rustle outside seemed amplified, filling me with dread. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, that something was lurking just beyond the reach of my headlights. The next morning I woke to the same dense fog and an eerie stillness. My car, once a sanctuary, now felt like a prison. With no other option, I decided to venture out in search of help. The forest was dense, the undergrowth thick, and the path, if there ever was one, was now long overgrown. The trees towered above, their branches intertwining, creating a canopy that barely let any light through. The air was damp and heavy, carrying a faint, musty smell. As I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The forest seemed to have a life of its own, its ancient trees whispering secrets in a language I couldn't understand. The sounds were unnerving, a mixture of distant rustles, soft whispers, and the occasional snap of a twig. Hours turned into days, and the forest showed no signs of ending. My hope of finding help was dwindling. Food and water were running low, and the relentless isolation was taking its toll on my mind. One evening, as I settled beneath a tree, I heard a voice. At first, I thought I was imagining it, but then I heard it again, a soft, melodic whisper calling my name. It seemed to come from all around me, the forest itself speaking to me. I followed the voice, drawn to it despite my fear. It led me deeper into the woods, to a clearing I hadn't seen before. In the center stood an ancient, gnarled tree, its bark twisted and its branches reaching out like arms. The voice was louder now, beckoning me closer. I approached the tree, my heart pounding in my chest. The air around it felt colder, charged with an energy I couldn't explain. Then I saw them, faces, countless faces etched into the bark, their expressions twisted in silent screams. I realized with a growing horror that the tree was alive, its trunk pulsating with a dark, malevolent force. I tried to run, but the forest seemed to shift around me, the trees bending and twisting, blocking my path. The whispers grew louder, a chorus of voices that filled my head, drowning out all other thoughts. I was trapped, the forest holding me in its grip, a prisoner to its whims. The realization dawned on me that I was not the first to be lured here, and I would not be the last. Days blurred into nights and lost all sense of time. The forest was my world now, a never-ending labyrinth of trees and shadows. I wandered aimlessly, driven by the faint hope of escape. The whispers continued, always there, a constant reminder of my entrapment. They spoke of forgotten times, of souls lost within these woods, and of a darkness that consumed all who dared to enter. I began to see things, shapes moving in the corner of my eye, figures that vanished when I looked directly at them. The forest was playing tricks on me, or perhaps revealing its true nature. One night, as I sat huddled against a tree, I saw it, a figure shrouded in mist standing at the edge of the clearing. It was tall and slender, its features obscured, but its eyes, glowing faintly in the darkness, were fixed on me. I felt a chill run down my spine, a primal fear taking hold. The figure didn't move, just watched, its presence both terrifying and mesmerizing. In the following days, I saw it more frequently, always watching, never approaching. It felt like a guardian of the forest, a keeper of its secrets and its prisoners. My mind began to fray, the constant fear and isolation taking their toll. I knew I couldn't survive much longer. The forest, with its whispering trees and unseen watchers, was consuming me, both body and soul. One morning I woke to find the figure standing closer than ever before. Its eyes bore into mine, and in that moment, I understood. The forest didn't just trap bodies, it trapped spirits, feeding off their despair. With the last of my strength, I stood and faced the figure. I didn't run or scream. I simply accepted my fate, a part of me relieved that it was finally over. As I looked into those glowing eyes, I felt a sense of peace, an end to the fear and struggle. The forest had claimed me, and in its embrace, I found a strange solace. And so I became another whisper in the woods, another shadow among the trees, another story lost in the endless expanse of the whispering forest. It was late October, and the sun was setting early, casting long shadows through the dense woods that bordered our small town. I had always been drawn to the forest, with its twisted trees and hidden trails that seemed to lead to another world. My friend, Alex, shared my curiosity, and together, we'd explored every nook and cranny of those woods since we were kids. But there was one place we'd never ventured, the old coal mine. Rumors had swirled around it for as long as anyone could remember. They said it was haunted, that miners had been trapped there in a collapse long ago, and their spirits lingered. Of course, we didn't believe in ghosts, but there was an undeniable thrill in the idea of exploring something so steeped in mystery. That day, as the chill of autumn bit at our cheeks, Alex and I set out with our backpacks, flashlights, and a shared sense of adventure. The path to the mine was overgrown, branches snaking across the trail like skeletal fingers. Fallen leaves crunched under our boots, the only sound in the eerie silence. As we trekked deeper into the forest, the light dimmed, obscured by the thick canopy above. The air grew cooler, and a mist began to rise from the ground, swirling around our ankles. It felt like stepping into another world, one that was untouched by time and the outside world. After an hour of walking, the trees began to thin, and we found ourselves standing at the edge of a clearing. In the middle lay the entrance to the coal mine, a gaping maw in the earth. its wooden frame rotted and creaking in the gentle breeze. It looked like a mouth ready to swallow us whole. We hesitated at the threshold, the thrill of discovery warring with a sudden, inexplicable sense of dread. The mind seemed to stare back at us, an unblinking dark eye that knew things we could not fathom. Shaking off the feeling, we switched on our flashlights and stepped inside. The air was immediately cooler, and the smell of damp earth and old wood filled our nostrils. Our lights flickered over the walls, revealing old tracks leading into the darkness and tools left, as if the workers had simply vanished mid-shift. We followed the tracks, our footsteps echoing in the vast emptiness. It felt like we were not alone, like the shadows were moving just at the edge of our vision. Every so often we'd hear a sound that made us stop and listen, a drip of water, a rustle that could have been just a rat or something. The deeper we went, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. It was as if the mine was alive, its breath cold and damp against our skin. The walls seemed to close in on us, and I had to fight the urge to turn back. Then we came upon a room that opened up on one side of the tunnel. Old wooden beams supported the ceiling, their strength long since ebbed away. In the middle of the room, there was an old elevator shaft, its cables rusted and hanging limply in the void. Curiosity drew us closer, and we shone our lights down into the abyss. It seemed to go on forever, a black hole that whispered of untold depths and secrets. As we peered over the edge, a sudden gust of wind howled up from the shaft, snatching Alex's flashlight from his hand. We watched in horror as it tumbled into the darkness, its light flickering until it was swallowed up by the shadows. A heavy silence fell over us. The loss of the flashlight felt like a bad omen, a sign that we should leave this place. But there was something compelling about the darkness, something that beckoned us to delve deeper into the mine's secrets. We pressed on, now sharing my flashlight, the beam seeming too weak against the encompassing darkness. The walls of the mine began to change, the stone appearing older, more weathered. We found carvings on some of them, strange symbols that made no sense to us but felt important, ancient. That's when we heard it, a faint tapping sound, rhythmic and persistent. It was coming from deeper within the mine, echoing off the walls in a way that made it impossible to tell its source. Our hearts raced with a mix of fear and excitement. Was it a remnant of the miners, a sign of something else, or simply our imaginations running wild? We followed the sound, drawn by an irresistible urge to discover its origin. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, as if calling to us. And then abruptly it stopped. We stood in the silence, our breaths loud in our ears, waiting for something to happen. That's when the ground beneath us trembled. The trembling of the earth beneath us was brief but unmistakable, sending a shiver of fear up our spines. For a moment, Alex and I exchanged glances, each seeing the other's unease reflected back. The mine felt alive, as if it were aware of our presence and didn't welcome it. We should have turned back then, but the lure of the unknown, the stories of the mine, kept us rooted. We pressed on, the darkness around us feeling heavier, as if it were a tangible thing. The tunnel began to narrow, the ceiling dropping lower, forcing us to stoop as we moved. The air grew thick, heavy with the scent of earth and something else. Something metallic. Our solitary flashlight beam seemed to struggle against the darkness, barely illuminating the path ahead. Suddenly, Alex stopped. He pointed to something on the ground. It was a miner's helmet, old and covered in dust, but still intact. Beside it lay a pickaxe and a lunch pail, as if the miner had just set them down for a moment and walked away. The sight was unsettling, like stumbling upon a moment frozen in time. We moved past the objects, each step feeling more labored than the last. The air grew colder, and a thin layer of frost began to form on the walls, glittering in the flashlight's beam. It was unnatural, this cold, as if the mine itself was exuding it. Then we heard it again, the tapping, but this time it was accompanied by a faint, echoing whisper. It was impossible to make out the words, but the sound sent a chill through me. It was like the mine was whispering its secrets, but they were in a language we couldn't understand. We reached a fork in the tunnel, the path splitting into two. Without a word, Alex and I took the left path, drawn by an unseen force. The whispers grew louder, a cacophony of voices that seemed to be right next to us, yet also far away. The tunnel opened up into a large cavern. Stalactites hung from the ceiling like jagged teeth, and in the center of the cavern was a pool of water, perfectly still and as black as ink. Our light couldn't penetrate its surface, and it felt like we were standing at the edge of the world. That's when we saw them. Figures standing on the other side of the pool, still as statues. They were miners, their clothes tattered and covered in dust, their faces obscured in the shadows. They didn't move, didn't make a sound, just stood there, watching us. Fear gripped us, rooted us to the spot. These were the spirits of the miners, trapped here for eternity. The whispers were their voices, calling out to us, drawing us into their world. Alex tugged at my arm, his eyes wide with fear. We needed to leave, now. We turned to retrace our steps, but the path we'd come from was gone, replaced by a solid wall of rock. Panic set in. We were trapped, just like the miners. We turned back to the pool, but the figures were gone, the cavern empty save for the two of us. The whispers had stopped, replaced by a deafening silence. In that silence, we heard a new sound, a low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from the depths of the earth. The water in the pool began to ripple, then churn, as if something beneath its surface was waking up. We backed away, our hearts pounding in our chests. The growl grew louder, more insistent, and then the water erupted. Something emerged from the pool, something dark and massive, with glowing red eyes that fixed on us. We ran through the tunnels, the growl chasing us, echoing off the walls. We didn't know where we were going, only that we needed to escape. The mine was a labyrinth, its passages twisting and turning in on themselves. Finally, we saw light, a faint glimmer in the distance. We raced towards it, the growl fading behind us. We burst out of the mine into the cool night air, the moon high in the sky. We didn't stop running until we reached the edge of the woods, the lights of our town visible in the distance. We collapsed on the ground, gasping for breath, our bodies shaking. We never spoke of what happened in the mine, not to each other, not to anyone. The town eventually sealed the entrance, and the mine was forgotten once again. But sometimes, when the night is still and the air grows cold, I swear I can hear the faint sound of tapping coming from the woods and the whispers of miners long gone, calling out from the depths of the earth. The forest had always been a place of solace for me, a retreat from the chaos of city life. But that day, the familiar trails seemed to transform, twisting into an unfamiliar labyrinth. I was an experienced hiker, yet somehow I had lost my way. The air grew colder, the light dimmer, and an unsettling silence fell over the woods. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting. As dusk approached, an eerie mist began to rise, slithering between the trees like a living entity. I pushed forward, hoping to find a way out, but the further I went, the thicker the fog became. It was then that I stumbled upon it, a clearing that I had never seen before, hidden deep within the heart of the forest. In the center stood an ancient oak, its gnarled branches reaching out like twisted hands. Around it, stone ruins lay scattered, remnants of a structure long forgotten. A chill ran down my spine as I realized that these were not just any ruins. They were the remnants of an old witchcraft grounds, a place of dark rituals and forgotten lore. I had heard stories about it in the local village, tales of witches who had once convened here under the full moon, but I had always dismissed them as folklore. Standing there amidst the decaying stones and the oppressive silence, I began to wonder if there was some truth to the legends. The air grew colder still, and I felt an inexplicable urge to flee, but my feet were rooted to the spot. Shadows seemed to dance at the edge of my vision, and I could almost hear whispers in the wind, unintelligible, yet unmistakably human. Fear gripped my heart, and I knew I had to leave, but as I turned to go, I saw her. A woman stood at the edge of the clearing, her figure barely visible through the mist. She was dressed in a tattered gown that seemed to blend with the fog, her face obscured by a hood. I called out to her, desperate for help, but she did not respond. Instead, she simply turned and began to walk away, disappearing into the forest. Compelled by a mixture of fear and curiosity, I followed her. The trees seemed to close in around me, their branches forming a tunnel that led deeper into the heart of the woods. The woman's figure was always just out of reach, a ghostly presence that beckoned me on. Hours passed, or maybe it was minutes. Time seemed to have lost all meaning in that place. The forest grew darker, the mist thicker, until I could barely see my hand in front of my face. And then, suddenly, she was gone. I was alone in the darkness, the silence, oppressive, suffocating. Panic set in as I realized I was hopelessly lost. I tried to retrace my steps, but every direction looked the same. A never-ending expanse of trees and fog. The whispers grew louder, a cacophony of voices that seemed to come from all around me. They were angry, accusing, their words unintelligible, but their intent clear. I ran, stumbling over roots and rocks, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The forest seemed to be alive, its branches reaching out to grab me, its roots tripping me up. The mist swirled around me, a living entity that sought to envelop me, to drag me down into its depths. Exhausted, I collapsed to the ground, my heart pounding in my chest. The whispers were all around me now, a chorus of malice that filled my mind with terror. I closed my eyes, praying for it to end, for the dawn to come and banish the darkness. But when I opened my eyes, I was no longer in the forest. I was in a different place, a room of stone and earth. Torches burned on the walls, casting flickering shadows that danced across the floor. In the center of the room stood a circle of stones, and within it, the woman in the tattered gown. She turned to face me, and I saw her face for the first time. It was a mask of sorrow and rage, her eyes hollow pits of despair. She spoke then, her voice a whisper that seemed to echo from the very walls of the chamber. "You have trespassed on sacred ground," she said. "You have disturbed the rest of those who dwell here." I tried to speak, to plead for mercy, but no words would come. The woman raised her hand and the shadows began to move, taking on forms that were both familiar and utterly alien. They were the spirits of the witches who had once gathered here, their souls bound to this place by their own dark rituals. They closed in on me, their forms twisting and writhing in the torchlight. I could feel their anger, their pain, their hunger for vengeance. They had been wronged, betrayed, their lives taken from them in the most brutal of ways. And now they sought retribution, a price to be paid for the peace they had been denied. The woman spoke again, her words a curse that chilled my blood. "You will bear witness to our suffering," she said. "You will share in our torment until the end of your days." The spirits reached for me, their hands cold and unyielding. I screamed, but there was no one to hear me, no one to save me from the fate that awaited me in the heart of the haunted grounds. I awoke with a start, my body cold and damp from the dew that had settled on my clothes. It was morning, the first rays of sunlight filtering through the trees. For a moment I wondered if it had all been a dream, a figment of my imagination fueled by exhaustion and fear. But the memories were too vivid, too real to be dismissed so easily. I stood up, my muscles aching, and looked around. I was still in the forest, but the oppressive atmosphere had lifted, the mist gone. The clearing with the ancient oak and the stone ruins was nowhere to be seen. It was as if the forest had shifted during the night, rearranging itself while I slept. Determined to find my way back, I started walking. The forest seemed different in the daylight, less menacing, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, sent a shiver down my spine. I kept seeing shadows out of the corner of my eye, fleeting glimpses of something that was always just out of sight. As I walked, the memories of the previous night played over and over in my mind. The woman in the tattered gown, the circle of stones, the spirits of the witches. They haunted me, their whispers echoing in my ears. I couldn't escape the feeling that I had somehow been marked by my encounter, that I had been changed in some fundamental way. Hours passed, and I began to despair of ever finding my way out. I was hungry, thirsty, and utterly exhausted. Just when I was about to give up hope, I stumbled upon a path. It was narrow and overgrown, but it was a path nonetheless. With renewed energy, I followed it, hoping it would lead me to safety. But as I walked, I realized that the path was leading me in circles. I was back where I had started. The same trees, the same rocks, the same sense of déjà vu. It was as if the forest was playing a cruel game with me, leading me on only to dash my hopes at the last moment. In a fit of rage, I screamed, my voice echoing through the trees. And then I heard it. A soft, mocking laughter that seemed to come from all around me. It was her, the woman from the night before. I spun around searching for her, but she was nowhere to be seen. "You cannot leave," a voice whispered. So close it felt like a breath on my neck. "You are one of us now." I spun around, but there was no one there. The laughter continued, a sound that was both beautiful and terrifying. I ran, my only thought to escape, to get as far away from that place as possible. But no matter how far I ran, I always ended up back at the same spot, the path leading me in an endless loop. It was as if the forest had claimed me, refusing to let me go. The realization hit me like a physical blow. I was trapped, a prisoner of the haunted grounds, just like the witches whose spirits still lingered there. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows through the trees, I knew I had to accept my fate. I sat down on a fallen log, the weight of my despair like a physical presence. I was alone, lost in a forest that was both familiar and utterly alien. The whispers started again, a chorus of voices that filled the night. They were the voices of the witches, their words no longer angry but welcoming. They had accepted me, embraced me as one of their own. I closed my eyes, letting the darkness envelop me. I was no longer afraid, no longer fighting. I was part of the forest now, part of its secrets and its shadows. I had become one with the haunted grounds, a guardian of its mysteries. And in that moment, I understood. The forest was not a place of fear and malice, but of power and magic. It was a sanctuary for those who had been wronged, a refuge for souls that had been betrayed. And I was its newest inhabitant, a spirit bound to the earth and the trees and the stones. The night was no longer a time of terror, but of peace. I sat there, listening to the whispers of the wind, feeling the pulse of the forest beneath my feet. I was home, and I would never be alone again. It was a cold, misty evening when I received the call. 4 hikers lost in the Evershade forest. The dispatcher's voice crackled over the radio. I'd been a search and rescue officer for years, but something about this call sent a shiver down my spine. Evershade Forest was notorious in our town, shrouded in unsettling tales and unexplained disappearances. I gathered my gear, a heavy sense of foreboding weighing me down. As I drove towards the forest, the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows between the gnarled trees. The forest loomed ahead, its dense canopy swallowing what little light remained. Upon entering the forest, the air grew cold and still. My flashlight beam seemed feeble against the oppressive darkness. The usual nocturnal sounds were eerily absent, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. I called out for the hikers, but my voice was swallowed up by the thick fog that rolled in, blanketing the ground. I stumbled upon the first sign of the hikers by accident, a torn piece of a map caught in the thorns of a bramble bush. My heart raced as I pressed on, guided by a strange internal pull towards the heart of the forest. As I ventured deeper, the trees seemed to close in around me. The mist twisted and turned, forming ghostly shapes that danced at the edge of my vision. I thought I heard whispers, but when I stopped to listen, there was only silence. Then I saw it. A dilapidated cabin, hidden beneath overgrown vines and moss. It wasn't marked on any map. As I approached, the door creaked open as if inviting me in. Inside, the air was stale, and the remnants of someone's stay were evident. A backpack, a half-burnt candle, and a journal lying open on a rickety table. I picked up the journal, the pages yellowed with age. The entries were frantic, scribbled in a shaky hand. They spoke of the forest, how it seemed alive, watching, waiting. The last entry was the most disturbing, a single sentence that made my blood run cold. The forest doesn't let go. A sudden noise outside jolted me back to reality. I stepped out of the cabin, flashlight in hand, sweeping the light across the dense trees. That's when I saw them. Figures standing just beyond the light's reach. I called out, but they didn't respond, just stood there, staring. Panic set in as I realized I was lost. The forest had changed around me, the paths twisted and unfamiliar. I wandered for what felt like hours, my calls for the hikers growing more desperate. Finally, I stumbled upon a clearing. In the center stood an ancient tree, its limbs twisted into grotesque shapes. Hanging from the branches were personal belongings, a water bottle, a scarf, a camera. It was as if the tree was a macabre trophy holder for all those who had lost their way. I heard whispers again, clearer this time, echoing around me. "Join us," they hissed, a chorus of lost souls bound to the forest. I spun around, trying to locate the voices, but saw no one. That's when I noticed the fog had thickened, swirling around my feet with a life of its own. Shapes moved within it, forms of people, reaching out to me with ghostly hands. I ran. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs ached. The forest seemed endless, a labyrinth designed to trap and confuse. Time lost meaning as the night stretched on, an eternal darkness. Exhausted, I collapsed beside a large rock, gasping for air. That's when I saw the faded engraving on the stone, a warning from long ago, eroded by time but still legible. Those who enter never leave. The realization hit me like a wave. The hikers. Were they ever real? Or was I lured here, another victim of the forest's curse? I tried to remember the call, the dispatcher's voice, but it all seemed like a distant dream. As dawn broke, the mist began to lift, but the forest didn't relent its grip on me. I wandered, aimless and lost, a ghost among the trees, forever searching for a way out that I'd never find. The sunrise brought no solace in the Evershade forest. The haunting whispers had faded, but their echo lingered in my mind. I was lost, wandering aimlessly through the trees that seemed to twist and contort with each passing hour. As I walked, fragments of memories began to surface. Laughter, camaraderie, the thrill of the hike. But they were like ghosts, fleeting and elusive. I couldn't grasp them, couldn't remember the faces or names of my companions. It was as if the forest had stolen them from me, leaving a hollow void in their place. The forest seemed to morph around me, paths leading to nowhere, trees bending unnaturally. I stumbled upon a clearing, one I hadn't seen before. In the center, a withered tree stood, its bark etched with indecipherable symbols. Beneath it, a shallow grave, marked by an uncarved stone. A chill ran down my spine as I approached. There, half buried under leaves and soil, were remnants of clothing and gear, strikingly similar to mine. My heart thundered in my chest as I unearthed a weathered search and rescue badge. It bore my name, my unit. Disbelief and horror washed over me. In that moment, the forest seemed to whisper my fate. I was not the rescuer, I was one of the lost hikers. The memories rushed back in a torrent. The laughter was mine, the camaraderie with friends I now remembered, the thrill of the hike that turned into a nightmare. The realization was crushing. I had been wandering these woods, not as a savior, but as a spirit, a phantom of my former self. The calls I made, the searches I conducted, they were all echoes of a life I once lived, a life that had ended in these cursed woods. I remembered the hike, the sudden storm, the panic as we lost our way. The darkness that fell, the feeling of being watched, hunted, and then nothing. A blank void where the end of my story should have been. The forest around me seemed to sigh, a mournful, ancient sound. I was one with the echoes now, a part of the Evershade's lore. My physical search was over, but my spirit remained, trapped within the confines of this haunted realm. I understood then the purpose of the whispers, the ghostly shapes in the mist. They were all lost souls like me, bound to the forest, reliving their last moments in an endless loop. As the sun climbed higher, casting eerie shadows through the trees, I accepted my fate. I was a part of the forest now, a guardian of its secrets, a whisper in its leaves. My story would be told in hushed tones, a warning to those who dared to tread in the Evershade forest. I stood there beneath the ancient tree, watching as the world of the living moved on without me. In the forest, time was timeless, and I was its eternal resident, forever wandering, forever searching. In the Evershade, the line between the living and the dead was blurred, and I, once a rescuer, had become just another legend, whispered in the shadows of the trees. I remember the roar of the engines, a comforting hum that turned into a deafening scream. It was supposed to be a routine flight, a quick hop for a business trip. But the world has a way of upending expectations, and mine were shattered the moment our plane plunged from the sky. The crash was a maelstrom of metal and fire. I remember the heat, the screeching of twisted steel, the screams. When I awoke, it was to a world of eerie silence, broken only by the occasional creak of cooling wreckage. I was alone, the sole survivor in a sea of debris, deep within the embrace of a forest that seemed untouched by time or man. The forest, with its gnarled trees and thick underbrush, was like something out of a twisted fairy tale. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of earth and something else, something cursed. I knew I had to find help, but every step seemed to draw me deeper into the heart of this haunted place. As I trudged through the underbrush, flashes of the crash haunted me. The way the cabin had shuddered, the sound of tearing metal, the faces of the other passengers, wide-eyed with terror. I shook my head, trying to focus on the present, but the past clung to me like the cobwebs that draped the trees. The forest was alive in a way that made my skin crawl. I heard whispers that seemed to come from the trees themselves, and more than once I thought I saw shapes moving in the corner of my eye. But when I turned, there was nothing there but the forest. Night fell quickly, the canopy above snuffing out the light like a wet blanket over a flame. The darkness in that forest was absolute, a blackness so deep it felt like a physical presence. I found a relatively clear spot and settled in, trying to ignore the rustling sounds that seemed to surround me. It was then that the real horror began. As I lay there trying to will myself to sleep, I heard it. A low, dragging sound like something heavy being pulled across the forest floor. It was far off at first, but it grew steadily closer. I held my breath, straining to hear, but when the sound stopped, it was replaced by something far worse. A whisper, so close it was like breath on my ear. "You should not have come here," it hissed, a voice filled with malice. I bolted upright, heart pounding, but there was nothing there. Just the trees, the dark, and the silence. But the silence didn't last. All around me, the forest erupted into whispers. Dozens of voices, all speaking at once, all saying the same thing. "You should not have come here." I ran. I didn't know where I was going, only that I needed to get away from those voices. But no matter how fast I ran, the whispers followed, always just behind me, always just out of sight. As I ran, the memories of the crash returned in vivid, terrifying flashes. The way the floor had tilted, throwing us all to the side. The sound of someone praying, their voice lost in the roar of the engines. The sudden sickening drop as the plane fell from the sky. And then, just as suddenly, I was falling again. My foot caught on a root and I tumbled to the ground, the air knocked from my lungs. I lay there, gasping as the whispers closed in. "You should not have come here," they said, a chorus of the damned. But it was what came next that froze my blood. A new voice, clear and sharp among the whispers. "Help me," it begged. "Please, help me." It was the voice of a woman, and it was filled with such pain, such fear. that I couldn't ignore it. I pushed myself to my feet, following the sound of her voice. It led me deeper into the forest, away from the path I had been following. "Help me!" she called again, and I quickened my pace. What I found was a clearing, and in the center, the wreckage of another plane, old and overgrown. It was as if the forest had claimed it, wrapping it in vines and moss. And there, among the wreckage, was the source of the voice, a woman, or what was left of her. She was pinned beneath a piece of the plane, her body twisted in an unnatural way. But it was her eyes that held me, wide and pleading. "Help me," she whispered, and I knew that she was not of this world, that she was a ghost, trapped in the moment of her death. I backed away, horror clutching at my throat. I wanted to run, to flee this cursed place, but her eyes held me, her plea echoing in my mind. "Help me." I don't know how long I stood there, trapped between fear and pity, but eventually the spell was broken, and I turned and ran, leaving the ghost and her plea behind. I ran until I could run no more, and then I collapsed, my mind a whirl of terror and confusion. I don't know how long I lay there, lost in my own thoughts. But when I finally looked up, I realized that I was not alone. Standing around me, just at the edge of the clearing, were figures. Dozens of them, all staring at me with hollow eyes. They were the passengers of my flight, their bodies broken, their faces twisted in the final agony of their deaths. And among them I saw her, the woman from the other plane, her eyes still pleading for help. "You should not have come here," they whispered, a chorus of the dead. And I knew then that I was trapped, lost in a forest of ghosts, a prisoner of my own guilt and fear. The dawn broke, a gray, listless light that did little to dispel the shadows of the night. I awoke to a world that seemed even more forsaken than before, the trees standing like silent sentinels, their branches twisted in silent screams. I pushed myself to my feet, every muscle aching, every breath a reminder of the nightmare I had endured. The faces of the dead haunted me, their pleading eyes following me even in the light of day. I knew I had to keep moving, to find a way out of this accursed forest. But as I walked, the whispers followed, a constant, malignant presence at the edge of my hearing. They spoke of death, of suffering, of despair, weaving a tapestry of horror that clung to my soul. The forest seemed to stretch on forever, an endless labyrinth of twisted trees and thorny underbrush. I stumbled on, driven by a dwindling hope, a feverish desire to escape. Then as the sun reached its zenith, I stumbled upon a clearing, and in the center a ruined chapel, its once holy walls crumbled and defiled. It stood as a monument to some long-forgotten tragedy, its broken bell tower reaching for a sky that seemed forever out of reach. I approached the chapel, drawn by a sense of fatalistic curiosity. The door hung ajar, its wood rotted and warped. Inside, the air was thick with dust and despair, the pews shattered, the altar desecrated. And there, in the center of the nave, lay a tomb, its lid cracked and moss-covered. I felt a chill run down my spine as I approached it, every instinct screaming at me to turn back. But I couldn't. Something about the tomb called to me, a siren song of sorrow and secrets. I reached out, my fingers trembling, and pushed the lid aside. Inside, there was nothing but bones, the remains of someone long dead. But on the skull, a crown of thorns had been placed, a macabre tribute to a forgotten king. As I stood there staring at the remains, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. They spoke of a curse, of a sacrilege that had doomed this place, of a wrath that would not be appeased. I beckoned away from the tomb, my heart pounding. I knew then that I was not alone. The deed of the forest were with me, their spirits bound to this blasphemous place. I fled the chapel, the whispers chasing me, their words a litany of doom. I ran without thought, without direction, driven only by a primal need to escape. But the forest would not let me go. The trees seemed to close in around me, their branches like clawing hands, their roots like tripping snares. And then, without warning, the ground gave way beneath me, and I fell. I landed hard, the breath knocked from me. I lay there dazed as the reality of my situation set in. I had fallen into a pit, its walls steep and slippery, the bottom lost in shadow. I tried to climb out, but the earth crumbled beneath my fingers, my efforts only causing me to slide further down. And as I slid, the whispers grew louder, a chorus of malediction. "You cannot escape," they said. "You are ours now." Despair washed over me, a tidal wave of hopelessness. I was trapped, doomed to join the lost souls of this damned forest. But then, amid the whispers, I heard a different voice. It was soft, barely audible, but it spoke of hope, of redemption. It told me to look up, and when I did, I saw a light, faint and flickering. But there, I reached for it, my fingers grasping at the air, and to my amazement, I felt something solid. It was a root, thick and strong, and it offered a way out. With renewed determination, I began to climb, the whispers growing frantic in their efforts to pull me back. But I ignored them, focusing only on the light above. I don't know how long I climbed, but eventually I reached the top. I pulled myself over the edge, collapsing on the forest floor, exhausted but elated. I lay there panting as the light grew stronger, and then, as if by a miracle, the forest around me began to change. The trees seemed to pull back, their menacing presence fading. The air grew lighter, the scent of death replaced by the smell of fresh earth and growth. I stood, my legs shaky but strong. The path before me was clear now, a way out of this nightmarish forest. I walked, my steps unsteady but resolute. And as I walked, the forest seemed to fall away, the whispers fading into nothing. I emerged from the trees, blinking in the bright sunlight. Before me lay a road that led back to the world of the living. I walked that road, leaving the forest and its ghosts behind. I didn't look back, not once. I knew that some part of me would always remain in that haunted place, trapped in the shadows of my own fears. But I also knew that I had survived, that I had faced the horrors of that forest and come out the other side. And for now, that was enough. The dense fog that rolled over the edges of Marrowwood Forest each night had become the subject of local legends. Whispered tales spoke of a shadowy figure that moved within it, just out of clear sight. As the senior forest ranger, I'd always dismissed these stories as the overactive imaginations of townsfolk, until the night I saw it myself. It was a routine patrol, nothing out of the ordinary. The darkness had settled in, cloaking the forest in its impenetrable shroud. That's when the fog began to creep in, thick and white, like a blanket being slowly drawn over the land. I had seen fog before, but nothing like this. It was unnaturally dense, reducing my world to a few feet in front of me. As I made my way through the forest, a sense of unease began to gnaw at me, I could hear the normal sounds of the night, the rustling of leaves, the distant hoot of an owl, but there was something else. A soft, barely perceptible sound, like footsteps, mirroring my own. I stopped, and so did the sound. An icy shiver ran down my spine. Trying to shake off the feeling, I continued on my path. That's when I saw it for the first time. A figure, dark and indistinct, at the very edge of my vision. I turned to look directly at it, but it was gone. A trick of the mind, I told myself, or perhaps a trick of the fog. But as I walked, the figure reappeared, always just beyond where I could see clearly. A flicker of movement, a shadow among shadows. My heart pounded in my chest. Was it following me, or was it leading me somewhere? Driven by a mix of fear and curiosity, I followed the figure deeper into the forest. The fog grew thicker, the trees a ghostly chorus of twisted shapes. My radio crackled to life, breaking the silence. "Ranger, come in. Are you all right? Over." It was base camp, checking in. I tried to respond, but my words were swallowed by the fog. I realized I was no longer on a familiar path. The forest around me felt foreign, hostile, even. The air was cold, heavy with a sense of anticipation. It was then I heard it again, the sound of footsteps, but this time they were faster, more urgent. I picked up my pace, and so did they. The realization hit me with a cold jolt. Whatever was out there was mimicking me. Every step I took, every move I made, it copied. I stopped abruptly, and the forest fell silent. I was alone, but not. The presence was still there. I could feel it. It was playing with me. I decided to head back, but the way wasn't clear. The fog disoriented me, blurring my sense of direction. Panic began to set in. I tried to retrace my steps, but everything looked the same in the misty gloom. That's when I heard a whisper, soft and malevolent, coming from all around me. "Lost." I spun around, trying to locate the source, but there was nothing, just the dense fog and the dark, silent trees. The whisper came again, closer this time. "Lost." It was mocking me. My breath came in short gasps as I stumbled through the underbrush, desperate to find a way out. The figure appeared again, closer than before, its form more defined. It looked like a person, but wrong, twisted somehow. I could feel its eyes on me, cold and unfeeling. The forest seemed to close in around me. The trees like silent judges watching my futile attempt to escape. The figure was always there at the corner of my eye, its movements eerily mirroring mine. I was trapped in a nightmarish dance with an unseen partner. I screamed, a raw sound of fear and frustration, and the forest absorbed it, muffling the sound. My only companion in this madness was my own echo, bouncing back at me, distorted and strange. Hours seemed to pass as I wandered, lost and afraid. The fog never lifted, and the figure never left. It was then I realized I was not just lost in the forest. I was lost in something far more sinister, a game played by a creature that called the fog its home. As the night wore on, my hope of finding a way out dwindled. I was a ranger, trained to survive, but this was something beyond my understanding. I was in its world now, a world of fog and shadows, where I was the prey, and it was the hunter, and it was closing in. As dawn threatened to break, the sinister dance continued. I was no longer just a ranger. I was a desperate soul trying to outwit an entity that seemed to be born of the fog itself. The cold tendrils of the mist clung to me, each touch sending shivers of dread through my body. The figure was relentless, its form becoming clearer with each passing hour. It was almost human, but horribly distorted. as if reflecting the twisted nature of the forest itself. Its eyes, dark and empty, seemed to pierce through the fog, fixating on me with an unsettling intensity. My mind raced, trying to think of a way out, a strategy to escape this nightmare. But the fog played tricks on my senses, making every direction seem the same. The trees stood like silent sentinels, their branches swaying slightly, as if in mockery of my plight. In a moment of clarity, I remembered an old ranger's trick, to find a stream and follow it to civilization. With renewed hope, I listened intently, straining my ears for the sound of running water. The forest was eerily silent, save for the soft, mocking laughter that seemed to come from the fog itself. Finally, I heard it, the faint sound of a stream. I moved towards it, my every step echoed by the figure. As I reached the stream, a sense of relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. The figure stood on the opposite bank, its form clearer than ever. It was an abomination, a grotesque mirror of myself, but with features all wrong. It mimicked my every move, but with a jerky, unnatural motion. It was as if it was learning, adapting to my movements. I followed the stream, but so did the figure. It was a twisted game of cat and mouse, and I was losing. Fatigue set in, my legs heavy, my breaths labored. The forest seemed to stretch on endlessly, the fog a never-ending maze. Then, as the first light of dawn began to pierce the fog, I saw it. A break in the trees. A way out. With the last of my strength, I sprinted towards it, the figure mirroring my desperate dash. I burst out of the forest and onto a road, the sunlight warm on my face. I turned back to look at the forest, expecting to see the figure emerge, but it didn't. The fog seemed to recede with the daylight, and with it, the figure vanished. Panting and exhausted, I sat down on the roadside. The terror of the night was over, but the memory of it would haunt me forever. I looked back at the forest, now serene in the morning light. It was hard to believe that such a peaceful place could harbor something so malevolent. As I made my way back to the ranger station, I knew my nights patrolling the forest would never be the same. The fog might lift with the morning sun, but the fear it brought would linger. The forest had revealed its dark secret to me, a secret I could never forget. Marrowwood Forest was more than just trees and wildlife. It was a living, breathing entity with a heart as dark as the figure that roamed its foggy nights. I was no longer just a ranger. I was a guardian of a forbidden truth. A truth that lurked in the shadows, waiting for the fog to return. If you enjoyed this video, please give us a like and please subscribe. Your support will help us tremendously. Thank you.